In November 1947, at a small trading post tucked along a frozen road in western Montana, a strange rumor began to circulate. Locals whispered about a man who had finally lost his grip on reality. His name was Earl Hutchkins, a 34-year-old former Army engineer recently returned to civilian life and trying to carve out a future on a stubborn piece of land. What sparked the gossip wasn't violence or drink, it was metal. Specifically a massive war-surplus quonset hut that Earl was dragging section by section up an icy trail toward his homestead. To the seasoned builders of the valley, this made no sense at all. A quonset hut was a military artifact, a half-cylindrical shell of corrugated steel meant to shelter vehicles' radios or ammunition. It was not a home, and it certainly wasn't meant to be wrapped around a log cabin like some kind of industrial cocoon. Men who had survived decades of Montana winters shook their heads. They saw waste, fear, and embarrassment. Some felt pity, others laughed outright. But Earl wasn't acting on fear, he was acting on memory. The winter of 1946 had broken something in him. His cabin, built according to tradition from thick, hand-notched spruce logs, looked strong enough to last a century. On paper, it should have been warm. In reality, it was barely survivable. Night after night, Earl watched his wife and daughters sleep fully clothed, wool coats pulled tight, breath fogging the air above their blankets. Rags stuffed under baseboards froze solid by morning. Frost crept along the interior walls like a living thing. No matter how much wood he burned, the cold always won. What Earl understood and what many frontier traditions ignored was that the enemy wasn't just temperature, it was wind. Log cabins failed not because the logs were thin, but because they were exposed. Every gust that slammed into those walls stripped heat away through convection. The fire inside wasn't heating a space, it was fighting a constant extraction of energy. In the Flathead Valley, where mountain terrain funneled air into relentless gales, this loss was catastrophic. Wind didn't knock politely. It clawed heat directly out of the structure faster than any stove could replace it. Earl had seen this principle before, not in books, but in military engineering. Equipment didn't freeze because it was weak, it froze because it was exposed. Shield it from airflow and everything changed. So while his neighbors mocked him, Earl Hutchkins wasn't abandoning frontier wisdom. He was correcting it. He wasn't running from winter. He was preparing to defeat it by breaking its most invisible weapon, the wind. Earl Hutchkins worked alone through early winter, his hands numbed and cracked as he bolted curved steel ribs into place. He did not dismantle his log cabin or replace it. Instead, he treated it like a fragile core, something to be protected rather than exposed. The quonset hut rose around it slowly, arch by arch, until the familiar lines of the cabin were swallowed inside a corrugated half-cylinder of war-surplus steel. Between the logs and the metal skin, Earl left a deliberate gap, roughly 2 feet on all sides. To the untrained eye, the structure looked absurd. A cabin wearing armor, rusted steel looming over peeled spruce logs. Calvin Drecker, whose family had built cabins the same way for 3 generations, called it a sweatbox and predicted mold, rot, and misery. Earl's own brother, a skilled carpenter, stood silently inside the shell one afternoon and finally shook his head. To him, it looked like surrender, as if Earl was afraid of winter instead of willing to endure it like everyone else. What none of them understood was the importance of the empty space Earl had created. That 2-foot void was not wasted air, it was controlled air. Wind could strike the metal exterior with full force, but it never touched the cabin itself. Inside the shell, the air remained largely stagnant. No gusts, no pressure-driven leaks, no constant stripping away of heat from the walls. The logs were no longer fighting the wind. They were isolated from it. The entire project cost Earl less than $120, scavenged from military surplus and assembled by hand. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pretty, but it was precise. Then December arrived. The winter of 1947 was not a typical Montana cold snap. It was a prolonged assault. Temperatures fell to -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chills screamed below -60. For 23 straight days, the cold did not relent. Fires burned around the clock across the valley. Families fed their stoves endlessly, only to sit shivering in 40-degree rooms, breath visible indoors. At Earl's place, something unprecedented happened. The temperature inside stabilized at 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Not briefly, not during daylight, constantly. His daughters did their schoolwork in cotton dresses instead of wool layers. The stove burned calmly instead of roaring. By the end of winter, Earl calculated that he had used 62% less firewood than the regional average. The explanation was brutally simple. By stopping the wind before it reached the cabin walls, Earl had eliminated most convective heat loss. The logs could finally do what they were meant to do: store and radiate heat, instead of bleeding it away. What looked like madness was in fact clarity. The metal shell didn't heat the house. It allowed the house to keep its heat. And in the dead of a Montana winter, that difference meant everything. Word of Earl Hutchkins's success traveled quietly, carried the way practical knowledge always does, through winter conversations, borrowed tools, and careful questions asked out of earshot of skeptics. Some listened. Others adapted the idea in ways that matched their land, their skills, and their beliefs. Near Livingston, along the banks of the Yellowstone River, a Korean War veteran named Harold Daw chose a different material to fight the cold. He chose stone. Harold understood something instinctively that few builders articulated at the time. Heat doesn't just need to be created, it needs somewhere to stay. Metal shells stopped wind, but stone could do something more. It could store warmth. Instead of leaving his quonset hut exposed, Harold wrapped it in smooth river rocks, gathered by hand from the Yellowstone's edge. He mortared them carefully, not into a solid slab, but into a textured skin filled with countless micro gaps. Each tiny pocket trapped air. Each trapped pocket slowed heat loss. The wall became thick, uneven, and deceptively alive with thermal complexity. Harold went further. He dug the structure 3 feet into the ground, placing the floor well below the frost line. Down there, the earth itself acted as a regulator, holding steady between 45 and 50 degrees year-round. Cold air might scream overhead, but underground winter lost much of its authority. He called the finished structure a passive thermal battery. When the first serious blizzard of November 1947 dropped 18 inches of snow overnight, Harold's brother Jim drove out, expecting the worst. Instead, when the door opened, he was hit with a wave of warmth, 72 degrees inside. Harold stood in shirt sleeves, calm and unhurried. During the day, the stones absorbed heat from the stove and even weak winter sunlight. At night, they released it slowly, evenly, without effort or fuel. Similar ideas appeared elsewhere. In Carbon County, Raymond Caulfield built inward instead of outward. His cabin featured an inner wall 18 to 24 inches thick, made from sandstone and limestone. Raymond wasn't interested in appearances. He cared about mass. Stone, he knew, was not insulation. In the traditional sense, it was storage. It delayed heat loss so long that cold struggled to gain ground at all. During the brutal winter of 1948, Raymond's home maintained 70 degrees with only 4 hours of fire per day. Nearby cabins burning constantly struggled to reach 47. The difference wasn't effort. It was physics. Stone didn't fight winter aggressively. It outlasted it. These builders weren't chasing comfort alone. They were redefining what endurance looked like: quiet, steady, and rooted in understanding rather than tradition. 3 decades later, winter returned to remind everyone that progress had not made nature polite. In January of 1978, a massive low-pressure system slammed into the Ohio Valley, and Great Lakes, collapsing the barometer, to an astonishing 956 millibars. This was not an ordinary blizzard. It behaved like a landlocked hurricane. Winds howled past 100 miles per hour, snow fell horizontally, and entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath drifts that climbed higher than rooftops. In Montana, the storm arrived, weakened but still merciless. Power failed. Roads vanished. Traditional homes built stronger than their eastern counterparts still bled heat as if punctured. It was during this winter that Vernon Hadley put a lifetime of hard-earned lessons to the test. Vernon was a former Navy Seabee, a man trained to build functional structures under fire with limited materials and no patience for aesthetics that didn't serve survival. He had watched earlier experiments with wind buffering and thermal mass, but he took the idea one step further. He called his solution nested architecture. Instead of placing a shelter around a home, Vernon placed a home inside a shelter. He assembled a modest 12 by 20 foot quonset hut, entirely within a massive timber barn built in the 1920s. The barn wasn't insulated, it wasn't sealed, it was sacrificial. Its job was to take the punishment. The wind battered its walls, tore at its seams, and roared through its gaps. But by the time air reached the quonset hut inside, its force was broken. Pressure equalized. Air slowed. Convection collapsed. Between the barn and the hut existed a vast buffer zone of dead air. Snow piled against the outer walls, adding yet another insulating layer. What remained inside was not warmth created by brute force, but warmth preserved by design. When the coldest night hit minus 47 degrees outside, with wind chills approaching minus 70, Vernon measured the interior temperature of his hut at 55 degrees. He did not feed the stove endlessly. Over 6 days, he burned just 112 pounds of wood. His neighbors burned more than 1,000 and still sat in 30-degree rooms wrapped in blankets watching frost creep across their walls. There was no mystery, no secret fuel, no heroic endurance. Vernon summarized it simply to anyone willing to listen. Survival did not require suffering. Efficiency was not weakness. And comfort properly engineered was not indulgence, it was intelligence. The blizzard of 1978 silenced mockery the same way winter always does. Not with arguments, but with results. Earl Hutchins, Harold Daw, Raymond Caulfield, and Vernon Hadley were never celebrated in textbooks. They didn't publish papers or hold patents. None of them claimed to be inventors. Yet what they shared was far more powerful than formal credentials. They observed failure without defending tradition, and they were willing to look foolish long enough to fix it. Each man began with the same problem, heat loss, and refused to accept the frontier answer that suffering was simply part of winter. Log cabins, roaring fireplaces, endless woodpiles. These weren't symbols of toughness to them. They were warning signs of inefficiency. Instead of adding more fuel, they asked a more dangerous question for their time. Why is the heat leaving in the first place? Their answers stripped winter survival down to first principles. Reduce exposed surface area. Eliminate drafts. Break the wind before it touches living space. Create buffer zones where air cannot move. Use mass stone, earth, and dense materials to store warmth instead of chasing it. Keep fuel dry burns slow and interiors sealed from pressure-driven airflow. What's remarkable is how modern these ideas sound today. Contemporary barndominiums, passive solar homes, earth-sheltered buildings, and double-envelope designs are rediscovering the same truths under new names. Engineers now speak of thermal envelopes, pressure boundaries, and convective decoupling. Earl and Vernon called it common sense earned the hard way. The quonset hut, once a disposable artifact of war, became a thermal fortress when paired with understanding instead of habit. The deeper lesson extends beyond architecture. Frontier history is often told through violence and conquest, rifles, railroads, and endurance myths. But survival was just as often won quietly, by men standing in shirt sleeves at -40 degrees, not because they were tougher, but because they were smarter. These builders proved something uncomfortable for their era, and ours hardship is not proof of virtue. Efficiency is not cowardice, and tradition, when left unexamined, can become a liability. With the right design, winter loses its authority. Man doesn't merely endure the cold. He contains it, outlasts it, and without drama, masters it.